Being the number one pick brings many different types of pressures. Unfortunately, of the last 10 years, not many of them have lived up to the expectation. So today, let's rank the last 10 number one overall picks from worst to best. Now for this list, we do have a certain amount of players who have only played a handful of games. For example, Bryce Young will be in this list, but he's only played one season, so it might be a little bit unfair for those guys, but for the purpose of the video, we will still be ranking them regardless. So with that being said, our number 10 and the worst number one overall pick of the last 10 years is going to be Bryce Young. Now, I hate really having to put him at number 10, but it's just a simple fact that he's only played one season and has not played good up to this point. Last year, as his only year being the starter, he had a completion percentage of 59.8% with only 2,877 yards, 11 touchdowns, and 10 interceptions. And as we all know, he wasn't quite the impactful player that we thought he would be, especially in year one. Now, what I will say about Bryce Young is I think his future is super bright, and I think as long as Carolina can surround him with the right talent, I think he can be a great quarterback and move up this list easily. And speaking of which, I just made a video on them, so if you do want to check that out, make sure to check out my most recent video. But for now, like I said, Bryce Young is my number 10. Let's go ahead and move on to number 9, Jameis Winston. Now, of the 10 players on this list, 7 of them are actually quarterbacks, and of course, a lot of them are still starters in this league, and unfortunately for Jameis Winston, he is not one of those guys. Now, statistically, he has been better than some of the guys ahead of him. However, up to this point into his career, he is just a certified backup, and that is what it looks to be for the rest of his career. Up to this point, since 2015, he has 22,104 yards, 141 touchdowns, and 99 interceptions. And arguably his best year of his career was in 2019 when he had 5,109 passing yards, 33 touchdowns, and 30 interceptions. Now, I'm not going to say that he is the biggest bust of all time, but given the fact that he has so much hype going into his rookie year and heading into the draft in general, I would say he's been relatively disappointing. Again, after his little stint with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which was the team that drafted him, he really hasn't done anything in the NFL, and while I do think he deserves a second chance somewhere else, I just don't know if it's ever going to happen. So for now, he's going to be my number 9. Now, my next player is Travon Walker, a player who a lot of people forgot was actually a number 1 overall pick. Travon Walker, up to this point in his career, only has 13.5 sacks, but last year he had 10 sacks. And while he really hasn't been the impact guy that many people thought he would be, it is also very noteworthy to say he was known to be an experimental player. I don't think anyone, including anybody within the Jaguars, thought that he was going to come in his rookie year and have 10 sacks, and well, he did it his sophomore year, and I think the outlook for his future is pretty bright. Now, is he a Micah Parsons, Nick Bosa, or anybody like that? No, but what I will say is I do think his future as a 10+ sack per season player is definitely a possibility. And for somebody who is super forgotten, even by myself, I would say that having 10 sacks is relatively impressive. It was a very quiet 10 sacks, but it was 10 sacks regardless. And the only reason why I have him this low on my list is, well, there's a couple better players on this list than him, and he does play a position that isn't as difficult as the quarterback spot. But I do think his future is super bright, and I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up in the top 5 of this list moving forward. But let us now move on to the number 7th player on this list, and is going to be Baker Mayfield. Now, Baker Mayfield has sort of had a bit of a resurgence with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and after having his best year of his career and leading the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to a playoff win, I do think his future in the league is pretty bright. Obviously, it did not work out with the Cleveland Browns, but I don't really know if he was worth the number 1 pick ever, so I do think that for what he's been, has been pretty impressive. Through his career up to this point, he has a little bit over 20,000 passing yards, 130 touchdowns, and 73 interceptions, and I think long term, his future with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is extremely bright. And the reason why he's ranked so low on my list is I just feel like the players ahead of him have had either better careers or are going to continue to be better players than Baker Mayfield. Baker Mayfield is a solid quarterback, but he is just truly nothing special, and I think we all understand that. Will Baker Mayfield be a consistent Pro Bowl level quarterback for the rest of his career? Maybe. I kind of doubt it. I think he'll be kind of on and off with going from team to team. The last thing I will say about Baker Mayfield is that without Dave Canales, I am a tad bit concerned for his future with the Buccaneers, but I do think that as long as he's there, it gives him his best chance to be successful. Now we're entering into a range where a lot of the players have been very good, or it's a little bit too early to tell. But what I will say is this player on my list had a very disappointing year last year, and I thought that he was going to be a great, almost MVP-like player, but he wasn't. And so it has knocked him down a couple spots, and that is Trevor Lawrence. Now, Trevor Lawrence in his rookie year was given a horrible deck of cards. He had obviously Urban Meyer and all the controversies you can ever ask for as a rookie quarterback. Fortunately for him, he did rebound very nicely in his sophomore year, and with Doug Peterson, it looked a lot better until the back end of last year. Like I said, Trevor Lawrence to me was somebody who could potentially reach for an MVP spot, but he did not quite reach that mark. In fact, he did not even make the Pro Bowl, which to me is super disappointing. Now, I do think Trevor Lawrence has a ton of talent, but what I will say is, based off what I saw last year, I think the amount of concerns I have for him have been growing. Do I think Trevor Lawrence is the worst quarterback on this list? No, I think he will be a starter on the Jacksonville Jaguars for the next several years, and I think moving forward, he will continuously be a Pro Bowl level quarterback. I just don't think I could put him in my top 5 quite yet until I see it with my own eyes. For now, we have to wait to see if he can be that guy we think he can be. Let us now move on to my 5th ranked player on my list, and again, I kind of forgot this guy was even drafted number 1 overall, and that is Jadeveon Clowney. Jadeveon Clowney hasn't really ever been that breakout pass rusher we thought he could be, but as a dominant run stuffer, he's been that guy for many years in the league. In his career, he has 363 combined tackles, with 115 of them being assisted. He has 1 interception, 1 touchdown, and 52.5 sacks in his entire career. Now again, I wouldn't necessarily say he's been disappointing, given the fact that he's been able to be a pretty consistent run stuffer to go along with being a decent pass rusher who can get a couple sacks. And while he's never had a double-digit sack season, I do think that he's generated a decent amount of pressures throughout his career. And I think moving forward, for whatever team he does play for, he's going to continue to be what he's been: a good run stuffer, a decent pass rusher, and somebody who can generate a ton of tackles. And while I don't think he'll ever be a Hall of Fame level player, he has definitely earned enough respect to be a top 5 player amongst these players on this list. He's made Pro Bowls, and I think moving forward, he'll continue to make a couple more. So I do think overall, his number 1 overall pick has been generally worth it. But now with our 4 remaining players, we have 3 quarterbacks and 1 defensive lineman. And I think we all know who that defensive lineman is, but we'll get to him a little bit later. Let's go ahead and move on to my number 4, Jared Goff. Now, Jared Goff is very similar to Baker Mayfield in a lot of ways. Early on, he had some moderate success with a couple bad seasons, but as a whole was relatively decent. Until eventually, for Jared Goff, he was traded to the Detroit Lions, and since he's been traded, he has been a very good quarterback in the NFL. Do I think he'll ever be an MVP player? No, but will he make consistent Pro Bowls? I think as long as this Detroit Lions team can be who it is, I could definitely see it. I personally think that last year was his best year as a pure quarterback, even though it wasn't maybe his best year statistically. I think as a pure quarterback, last year was his best. I think as long as Jared Goff is the quarterback for any team and they have enough talent on the roster, they can compete for championships. And for a guy who was drafted number 1 overall, I think that's kind of what you expected from him. Would it be nice if Jared Goff was Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen or guys like that? Sure, but I think what he is a good enough quarterback to get the job done. And I think as long as he's with Detroit and Detroit keeps trending in the right direction, I think his future is super bright. Again, is he somebody who can carry a bad franchise on his back? No. But what I think he can be is a good enough quarterback to get the job done. For now, he is my 4th ranked player of the last 10 first-round picks. Now we enter the top 3, and unfortunately, I kind of feel like number 3 is a tad bit underwhelming, but I feel like based off what I've seen and what he can do moving forward, he's got to be number 3. But again, given the fact that these are the number 1 overall picks, for this guy to be number 3 is, in my opinion, crazy. But my number 3 player is Kyler Murray. Now, Kyler Murray is a great quarterback, but is he a top 10 quarterback? No. And for him to be ranked the number 3 ranked player of the 10 first overall picks, to me is a little bit sad. To me, a number 1 overall pick should be franchise changing. And while Kyler Murray, you could say, has been relatively franchise changing, I don't think it's been to the extent that we thought it could be. Kyler Murray's been great when he's played, but he's also had injuries, and the team around him has just always been bad. Now, Kyler is good enough to win this team 10 games in a season just by himself because he is generally a good quarterback, but I don't know if he's ever going to be somebody who can carry a decent roster to a championship like a Patrick Mahomes or a Josh Allen could. Now, again, no disrespect to Kyler Murray, I think he's a top 20 to top 15 quarterback, but for you to be the number 1 overall pick and this to be the 3rd ranked player on my list is kind of crazy. But now we get to the pinnacle of what you should expect from a number 1 overall pick. Our next 2 players are fantastic, Pro Bowl, MVP, Defensive Player of the Year-like players, and I do think my number 2 is going to be a little bit controversial. I am going to put Joe Burrow at number 2. Joe Burrow has been fantastic in his career, but unfortunately, he's just been freaking injured all the time. Last year he had injuries, he was obviously injured his rookie year, but when he plays, he's been fantastic. I think anyone who says that Joe Burrow isn't a top 5 quarterback is just simply hating. In fact, I would have him probably ranked 4th or 3rd on my list, and I think as a pure quarterback, he's one of the best we have in the NFL. He can consistently make plays with his receivers, and even though the Bengals have been a team that isn't necessarily built to win championships, Joe Burrow has been good enough to get that team to that mark. And while he did not win the championship against the LA Rams, I think the simple fact they got there tells you how good he truly is. And long term, he's going to continue to be a big part of that Cincinnati Bengals roster. Joe Burrow to me is the perfect number 1 overall pick, and he's everything that we expected from him, and I think moving forward, he's going to continue to match those expectations. But now we get to my number 1, again, could be controversial, going Myles Garrett. Garrett hasn't had the accolades per se of other great players, but based off this list, I would vouch to say that Myles Garrett has been better as a pure player than Joe Burrow. Now, I understand that Joe Burrow plays a harder position than Myles Garrett, and I'm not going to sit here and deny that. But based off what Myles Garrett has been able to do at his position, I think he deserves to be number 1. Myles Garrett just earned his first Defensive Player of the Year award. He has made the Pro Bowl several times and will continue to be an All-Pro, Pro Bowl level player every single year. He, to me, is the best pure pass rusher in the NFL, and I think he's a very good and underrated run stuffer in this league. And moving forward, he's going to be one of those guys who is a super highly paid and respected player who doesn't play the quarterback position. So you can say that Joe Burrow is better than Myles Garrett, but I think based off everything that I've seen and based off the fact that Burrow hasn't been able to stay healthy, I gotta give it to Myles Garrett. And long term, Myles Garrett will continue to be a top 10 player in the NFL. Now again, to kind of put a cherry on top of this thing, I do think it is crazy that of the 10 first overall picks, only really 2 of them have been All-Pro, Hall of Fame level players. Do we expect Jared Goff, Kyler Murray, Baker Mayfield, Jadeveon Clowney to make the Hall of Fame? Probably not. And I do think it tells you that having the number 1 overall pick, while as great as it might seem, isn't necessarily what it is always cracked up to be. Again, when you have the number 1 pick, you have all the leverage in the world to do whatever you want with it, but based off the track record, I don't know if it's been that great.